Hello everybody, welcome back to Dominions 5. We are doing our battle plan analysis for our game as Tien. Of course, we're really far advanced into the game. This game has lasted forever. I think we're on turn 130 something, which is pretty special. In previous episodes, I've just done sort of the basic nation analysis, and we've gone over all the units and the mages. But I've just talked about them sort of briefly without putting them into context. So in this episode, the way I think I'm going to approach this is I want to talk about the early game, the mid game, the late game. But all of this is stuff that we're thinking of before the game starts, right? This is how we're going to plan our build. And how we want to think about our nation's strengths and weaknesses, and then that's also going to inform like what our priorities are going to be in terms of research and things like that. So let's talk about, I guess the first thing we need to talk about is something that you can practice even without being in a multiplayer game, which is expansion, right? How are we going to expand with our... Actually, I will load up this game again. How are we going to expand with Tien? So I think you have two options. So you can do sacreds. You can do sacred heavy cav with a bless. Heavy cav can take a pretty killy bless if you wanted to. They can also take cavalry tends to take a rainbow bless very well. Or it could be a fairly minor bless, like just one or two useful things. And they can expand quite fine. Honestly, you don't even need sacreds. Like you can expand with regular heavy cav as well. So you could do a build where you're like full scales, no bless. You don't even touch the sacred heavy cav. You just do regular heavy cav. And the thing that you need to plan for, and the trick in doing this, and this you do just by practicing and doing it a few times, is you need to tune your scales to the map that you're playing and how many provinces are connected to your capital. So in multiplayer games, typically you have the map ahead of time. So I knew that this was going to be my map, okay? So I knew that I had only one forest in the provinces around me, okay? And that means that I'm not getting my capital here is not slurping up a lot of resources. Now this is the end game. I've already upgraded it to whatever level this is, because you can do that later on. But in the early game, on the first turn, first of all, you need to know exactly how many resources you're going to get per turn, because resources are going to be the limiting factor in recruiting heavy cavalry early on. So you have to check in your scales how many order scales, like how much order scales do you need, productivity scales do you need to get enough cavalry out each turn to make your expansion successful, okay? And that's some math that you have to play with. Now, if you're doing sacreds, and this is true for other nations, not just Tien, but if you're doing sacreds, eventually you're going to run into the limit in terms of holy points. So if you're doing a rainbow, then it's expensive to get high dominion. But on the other hand, if you only go for 4 or 5 dominion, you're only going to be able to get maximum 4 or 5 of these sacreds out. So that's kind of not worth it, right? You want to have a bit more dominion. Now, of course, later on, nowadays in the game, you can build a ton of temples and get your dominion up really high. So in the late game, you can say I have holy points to spare, but that's only in the very, very late game. So another scale we have to balance is dominion candles, right? So in most cases, with reasonable, like positive scales, like anywhere between 1 and 3 in order and productivity, most nations that do heavy cavalry sacreds can get away with like 6 or 7 dominion, but you need to test that. The final limiting factor, at first resources are going to be an issue, but it could very well be that recruitment points become an issue. Now later on, recruitment points are not an issue because as your provinces grow, you just get a lot more recruitment points. It's It's not an issue later on, but in the early and the mid game, that might be the thing that limits you. So in other words, if you took a ton of productivity scales but not enough order scales, you're not going to have enough recruitment points to get your guys, even though you had plenty of resources. Gold is rarely the limiting factor. You could just not recruit stuff elsewhere. Like obviously you need to have some gold, but that's not the biggest issue. So you need to, when you design your build, you need to find the exact right balance in terms of candles, order, and productivity to do this kind of sacred build. And that, I can't give you the correct formula for this nation because it depends on the map. It depends on how many hills or forests you're going to have nearby that are going to suck in resources, right? That's going to affect your productivity scales. Okay, that is if you are doing sacreds. If you're not going to do sacreds at all, or if you're barely going to rely on them, and you're totally fine padding with Imperial Horsemen, then you can get away with much lower candle count, and you, as a consequence, you're probably going to go order 3 productivity 3 anyways, so it's irrelevant. You just max your scales and you recruit as many of these guys as you can every turn. Okay, so with that being said, let's go back and let's kind of redesign this pretender. So, well, let me show you the pretender that I did, but keep in mind that this is no longer, the bless here is no longer valid because this was with an earlier version of the game. So swiftness used to be 2 air and magic weapons used to be 2 astral. Okay, so as you can see, we went rainbow. Most of the time, the Frostfather ends up being the best rainbow chassis because the 2 paths that he has, he comes with air 1 and water 1, just makes it like a couple of points cheaper, and you're able to get most, and you're able to just squeak in a little bit more in your build. That being said, that's not necessarily true if, as part of your bless, you're planning to go up to like 5 in one of the paths. In that case, often the rainbow chassis that has that path, like let's say you wanted fire 5 in your build, then the fire mage or whatever he's called is sometimes your best bet. But overall, Frostfather is and just end up picking him a lot just because you just get like 1 or 2, like you get 8 more points, and that's enough to give you 1 additional scale or something like that. So obviously he's going to be imprisoned. Let's talk about the scales that we have. So we have 7 Dominion candles, 2 order, 2 productivity. So as I was just talking about, that is enough in my testing to sort of reliably recruit sacreds in the early game to expand with, and to max out once I've cleared my cap circle to have a reasonable and like to be able to recruit. So remember, in for a nation like Tien, we have let's actually design a pretender here. Remember, when you do your candles, probably in your capital, you're going to end up recruiting some kind of sacred mage, because most of the cap mages are sacred, but not always. So in this case, one of our holy points is going to this guy. So we actually only have 6 holy points to spend on these. So we have to have enough scales to afford 6 of these guys per turn with what the map gives us. So in my case, that was 2 and 2. All right, here we go. So these are our options, right? So we have, for example, in Tianqi's case, we actually have a national chassis here, which is a bit cheaper, and it gives us astral, but it was cheaper for me to use this chassis compared to this one because of the extra path. Like, it just works out that way. Now I went with a rainbow build, and we'll talk about the rainbow build that I did in more detail. Now, what would be some other options with Tianqi? You have access to some awake expanders. I don't think you need them because Tianqi doesn't need an awake expander. You expand just fine with your troops. That being said, if you were playing a really small game, where you were afraid of being rushed or something, you can never go wrong with an earth snake or something like that. I don't think it's necessary to go, you can do funky things with the Raven of the Underworld. Actually, I think in Lucid's Let's Play with Yomi, his team tries to pull something off here with the Corpse Eater. These Dragon Kings are not... it just doesn't, like, as an expander, it doesn't work very well. Like, just water is not a great path for expansion. Then you have some Titans. We do have access to a fairly decent chassis in the Celestial General. So this could be a totally legit build. This guy can be a great super combatant. These are great paths, right? Earth, Astral, Air. I don't think you even need to add any more than that, right? You can get like... so you could do a build like... in using the current version of Dominions, right? Like you could do, and suppose this guy was going to be like dormant, right? So he comes online after year 1. You go construction early, get him a kit, and he's like super badass. I think magic weapons. We'll talk about magic weapons a bit more later. If you're playing against other astral nations, maybe you need to go more than 4 if you're worried about Mind Hunt. But you got a ton of astral mages, so the chances are that they're not Mind Hunt. Magic Duel, you just bring a bunch of astral mages with this guy and he's fine. Maybe Fire and Shock, and then Swiftness. Like something like that, right? I haven't put too much thought into this. This gives you, and then whatever you can do, you figure out some skills that work. This could give you a reasonable super combatant chassis. You can, and the bless on your sacreds is not completely useless. As a human nation, we're vulnerable to nations that have some kind of bless, or nations that have some kind of ability that does elemental damage because we don't have any built-in resistances. We also don't have any magic weapons on our summons or anything. So having magic weapons as part of the bless, I think, is pretty important. I think now I've come to the conclusion that you always want to have some kind of way to deal with ethereal thugs like golems and things like that. You want to have some kind of magic weapon access on your nation. Now, it used to be when we played this game, magic weapon was only 2 astral. Now it's up to 4 astral, but I still think it might be worth it. Anyways, this is a totally legitimate build. But if you compare, like my build, I had 7 Dominion, and these are the kinds of scales that I had. Okay, so we can actually get similar scales, right? These are actually the exact same scales that I took on my Rainbow. My guy was imprisoned. This guy is dormant. So obviously with this guy, we're going to have a much powerful early game when this guy comes online. What are we sacrificing? We're sacrificing some magic diversity. Now, you're thinking, but your Tien, you have amazing magic diversity. True. We don't have death or blood access, however, built in. We have no way really of getting it. Well, that's not true. You can go through nature. You can get Lamia Queens, which could get you into death and blood. But that's harder. That's hard to pull off. The other thing is, although we have great magic diversity, we don't have... here. Our paths are very low. So for boosters and forge and climbing up the trees in terms of magic paths, we're actually kind of screwed. So most paths, like except for water, basically, to boost air is really hard. You have to start at air 4. Fire, you have to start at air 4 unless you have fire death. We don't have any fire death built in, right? So a lot of these paths, although we have access to them and we can cast everything because we can do communions, in terms of boosters for forging items, we're kind of stuck. So this is going to limit some of our magic diversity in the long run. So that's the trade-off that you're doing. Now, in a smaller sized game, this might be stronger. This might be a stronger choice. However, the game that we're playing is a 20-player game, so it's going to be massive. We did expect it to go into the very late game, so I preferred having an awake, a rainbow, an imprisoned rainbow pretender. You could also do you could do a kind of killy bliss with a statue of war. So this would be something. If you were doing this, would be great for a small game where you are fighting. Where one of your neighbors is going to be has like a giant meme bless, for example, and you need extra help, and you need is a nation that they're gonna come at you with thugs that are gonna be really hard to kill. So this chassis in particular, with fire and earth, you can do you can do attack skill. Maybe you need fire resistance or not. I don't know. Let's assume that you don't, right? Strength. More strength, why not, right? And maybe you can throw in even some blood here, whatever, right? But these paths are going to make your heavy cavalry extremely killy. And in fact, you can take this imprisoned, so you can then go like extra scales if you need, and we can add another path here to our bless to tailor it more to the game that you're playing. Maybe you need magic weapons, maybe you want to get blood surge, whatever, right? There's defense, like the cavalry takes a defense or swiftness really well. Maybe you need some resistance in here. So you can make your heavy cav super extra killy, and that could be necessary against some nations. If you're afraid of them going for some kind of mimi sort of unkillable giants or whatever, right? But we'll talk about that a bit more, but we'll talk about it specifically with the nations that we have that we're going to be playing with. There are other titans to play with. I only highlighted this one, but I think you can do fun things with the Natarajas, with a lot of with all these extra weapon slots, right? This can be fun. There are a lot of options to play with. In our case, we went with a rainbow. We had these paths. So let me bring them up. I'll talk about the paths in a second. Let me talk about the scales here. So like I said, we already talked about order and productivity. Now we need some points. So do we go for heat scales or cold scales? Well, cold scales make your logistics easier because things stay pretty much frozen, and so you can move around over rivers much more easier. Plus, this guy happens to have cold power, so I guess. The only weakness of going cold scales is that it makes you vulnerable to Murder Winter. Murdering Winter is one of the 2 spells that makes late game super painful for any human nation. It just basically wipes out a ton of your army. Here it is, Murdering Winter. It does armor negating damage to 40% of the army. I believe. I say that 40%. I don't know why I said 40%, or it's either half of that. But this is affected by scales, by temperature scales. So if you're in a hot province, this is completely useless. But if you're in a cold province, you're going to take a beating. So this is a pretty nasty spell. So if you take heat scales, it makes you almost immune to it. If you take cold scales, you're going to take that's going to hurt. But the thing is, you're still going to be vulnerable to fires from the sky. That's inevitable. But at least by taking heat scales, you could be basically immune to Murdering Winter. But we end up going cold scales. Part of that also has to do with our neighbors. So I'll talk about that we'll talk about that later. Growth. So growth is a really strong scale. It's one of the best economic scales. Why not take growth 3? Partly because we couldn't afford it. Partly it's because this is a game with all the level 2 thrones, and a lot of those thrones have growth bonuses built in. And if you already have growth 3 and you get a throne with a growth bonus, then that's basically wasted. In this large of a game, you're quite likely, in my experience, to end up getting some kind of growth bonus in a throne. So taking growth 2 is good enough, and then you'll probably end up at growth 3 with a throne during the game. So that's my reasoning. And then we take a bit of misfortune to pay for our scales, and I kept magic neutral. I think you can go drain because your researchers are that amazing. You could go magic and have like unbelievable research. I could see it either way. I kind of decided to not do anything in particular. I don't know. It'd be, I think there might be different builds that would be possible with magic or drain. I didn't, when you're thinking about magic in general, if you're sort of an average nation with average research and you're having a pretty good game, I think you can expect to have the full tree researched at like turn 80. If your nation is like better than average at research, maybe turn in the 70s. It's definitely possible. That's certainly what I did in this game. I was all done by 70. Same thing in my the other game that I'm playing in, which is Black Swan. I'm playing as Marverni. We were all done our research by turn 70. I think both nations have pretty good research potential, so it's not too surprising. So what I'm saying is you don't really need the extra research help. Like you'll be fine on research. Okay, let's talk about the bless. Let's get all of these. Let's get all these up here. What do we need? Obviously, this is inaccurate, but we'll fix it. So, okay, let's work from the bottom up. Blood. Blood Surge. If you're going to go sacreds that are just going to be average sacreds that you're killing, Blood Surge is amazing. It's excellent part of any bless. The only time you take Strength of the Flesh, which is pure strength, because Blood Surge gives you more strength, but the thing is you have to kill something, and you have to kill something that is living, or that has blood. Actually, it will not take effect when killing an inanimate unit. So if you're fighting like a bunch of skeletons, this is useless. Also, if you're fighting like meme-blessed giants, this is also useless because the whole point is they're impossible to kill, so this will never proc. In that case, you might as well go Strength of the Flesh, or even more hit points. I should mention, as part of building a bless here, we don't really have any sacred mages. I keep hitting the wrong key. Our important mages, the geomancers, are not sacred. These guys are sacred, but they're going to be communimasters, so fatigue doesn't really matter. So if for some nations you are tempted to add some hit points to your bless to make it so that the regeneration ticks on your communion slaves goes up by 1, right, and things like that, or you want to take reinvigoration to help your mages, or you want to take Arcane Finesse or Farcaster, this is not really useful for Tien because you've only got the cat mages, and I mean, yeah, they're nice, but most of the spells are going to be cast by other mages that are not sacred. So this is purely for our Red Guard, for our cavalry. So Blood Surge in our case, because we don't have to deal with Meme Bless giants. Okay, I guess let's go back to the top here. In Fire, the eternal question is, do I get attack skill or do I get fire resistance? That is always a tough call to make. You can also get fire resistance in here if you wanted to. In this game, I went for attack skill, and the reasoning is that I did not have any immediate fire threats in my sort of immediate neighbor circle. There is Marignan, but I don't directly neighbor him. He's sort of off to the northwest. I'll show you the map later. And so I was confident that by the time I would have to fight Marignan, I could easily have access to fire resist buffs. So as Tien, you basically can cast every spell in the game without too much trouble. So the issue is more like in the first 2 years, do you need this resistance buff to win a war? And I decided I was going to get away with not having fire resistance, because if you take fire resistance, you can't take attack. And attack skill is nice because I'm going to be relying on my Red Guards to be super killy. We want them to be even killier, so we're going to buff their attack, right? That's just pretty straightforward. So then in air, I went for swiftness and minor shock resistance, because at the time, swiftness only cost 2. However, it also did not, I say that I don't remember I don't think it gave defense. It just gave movement speed. So I went 3 air and I did movement speed and minor shock resistance. I think movement speed on heavy cav is, it can certainly be nice. You can like do attack rear stuff. They're just gonna get there right away. The problem can be if you're using this heavy cav with other cav, then they're just always gonna run ahead, and they're gonna be the first thing that makes contact with the enemy, no matter what, because they're gonna be super fast. Before swiftness gave +1 defense, I would say that major shock resistance would have been just as good. Because shock resistance is always something that's good to have, because later on you're always going to do Army of Lead, Army of Gold. That's going to debuff your shock resist, so you want to have more of that. In terms of the nations surrounding me, I didn't have any huge air threats, although I did have Mictlan as a neighbor, and Mictlan tends to get funky blesses, and sure enough, in Mictlan's bless, there was thunder weapons. So having minor shock resistance came in very handy in this game. But nowadays, I do think that the +1 defense in swiftness is a really good get. If for a unit that can use a defense, and heavy cavalry in general have high defense, so you want to stack more defense on high defense units. So I definitely think swiftness is a good investment. In water, we just went for defense skill. That is a classic thing you get as part of a Rainbow Bless. We did not need, I don't think I got any cold resist as part of the Bless. I could be wrong. I'll have to look it up again. Maybe I did. Maybe I didn't. I'll have to double check if the numbers add up at the end here. Once again, normally as a Rainbow Bless, I do think you want to get some resistances, but I think Tien can kind of get away with not doing it because they can so easily cast all the resist buffs early on. Okay, in Earth, I'm pretty sure I got Strength. Larger was not accessible. I don't think larger is worth it. Cavalry are size 3. That's the perfect size. Pretty sure we got Strength here. Pretty sure that's what we got. Okay, again, just to make them killier and deal more damage. In Astral, nowadays magic weapons cost 4, and I would still recommend it because we have no other ways to do any kind of magic damage. Obviously, we have spellcasters, but our units have nothing. I think it's worth it. At the time, with the extra 2, I also got Spirit Sight and minor magic resistance. Minor magic resistance is always nice because our sacreds they're humans. We don't have amazing magic resistance. We only have 12. So, more magic resistance is great. Spirit Sight, because we don't have a great way to deal with darkness shenanigans. We are neighboring Shinuyama, which is a death nation. And so darkness could definitely be a thing. If you can't afford Spirit Sight, you can definitely instead go for low light vision in nature, which is which only gives you 50%, but that's an alternative. So that is what we went with. The other thing is the reason this works well with our build is because in death there really isn't anything great. We don't really withering weapons. I kind of like it sometimes. I like it more than most people, but if you're not going to do withering weapons, then there's nothing else really worth getting on an imprisoned chassis. Just Stygian Flesh is not going to be relevant for us. So typically you end up going with Undying. The thing is, you do want Death 4. Death 4 is the amount of death that you need on a Pretender to really make, to be able to go, to get everything you need without needing to empower, okay? Because a Lich needs Death 5 to be summoned and is a Death 4 mage. And you can build a Skull Staff, which will get you to Death 5, but the Hat, which is the next Death booster, costs 5. You have to be 5 Death to make it. Now, of course, you could build like a ring of sorcery, and we also have astral access. So if we had death 3, we could climb our way up the ladder. So you can, if you have astral access, you can actually get away with death 3. That's fine. Death 3, you make the skull staff, and then you have a ring of sorcery. But that requires an investment in astral, which you might not be able to do. I went with Death 4, I'm pretty sure, and part of that is because of the hit points, which we'll talk about in a second, and I wanted the Spirit Sight, so that worked out for me. In Nature, you have to ask yourself, do I need Poison Resistance? Poison Resistance is always useful, and I had Satis not too far away, and we also had Micklin on our border, which could do... which can do foul vapors and stuff like that. Because we weren't directly neighbors with Satis, I felt like I needed to take major poison. I went minor. And part of the reason why I went minor is because I wanted to get as many hit points as I could. I think this is basically the build that we ended up taking. Something like this. I'll load up the actual Pretender. Of course, things don't quite add up now because the balance has changed in the patches. But this is what it looked like. So let me talk about hit points. The weakness of the Red Guard is that a quarter of the year in the fall, they have 6 hit points, which is like nothing. A straight arrow can kill them. So having extra HP on these guys, I think, is kind of necessary. Because you can't control when you're going to fight your war. So with this build, we have a built-in 2 extra hit points, plus we have 6 extra temporary hit points, which, in the mid-game, we're going to start to do mass regeneration anyways. So that actually makes our heavy calf fairly tanky and not completely garbage if we have to fight with them in the fall. Okay, let me just load up the actual Pretender just to make sure I did this right. Yeah, we took attack, skill, strength. Yep, exactly. That's exactly the build I went for. Okay, we've been going on for quite a while. It's been over 30 minutes, so I'm going to wrap up the episode now. There are a lot more things to talk about in terms of how we're seeing. I've only sort of talked generally about this build and how it's maybe going to deal with some of our neighbors, but I want to talk more about how we would defend against a rush, how you defend against sort of a meme bless, about an awake expander, but I'll get to that in the next episode, which I'll record shortly, so see you guys then. Take care.